On a humid Monday morning in Vietnam in the fall of 2003, 12-year-old An Bui sat at her school desk. She was bent over her notebook, working on a writing assignment, when her left hand got sweaty and started cramping. She dropped her pencil to shake her hand out and noticed the pencil had blood on it. An looked down and saw a smear of blood across her palm, but she didn't remember cutting her hand on anything. She grabbed a tissue from her backpack and wiped off the blood. She thought maybe the pencil had given her a splinter, but she couldn't see a cut anywhere. And the red liquid on her palm definitely was not paint or some other substance. It was blood, and it seemed to have come out of nowhere. An didn't like it when people looked at her, so she threw the bloody tissue into her backpack before anybody noticed. She decided not to tell anyone what had happened. The blood must have just gotten on her hand at some point that morning, and she didn't notice. An figured whatever it was not worth worrying about. So she turned her attention back to the lesson and tried to put the strange moment out of her head. A few months later, An was reading at her desk, trying to ignore a headache. It was hot and muggy, which only made the headache worse. Her forehead was covered in sweat, and she felt a bead of moisture slide down her nose. She wiped it with the back of her hand, and as she did, she noticed a smear of blood. Her forehead was bleeding. An immediately looked down at her desk and let her hair fall around her face so nobody could see it. She tried to be inconspicuous as she touched her forehead, searching for a cut. The skin was unbroken, but there was more blood on her fingertips. And to make matters even stranger, there was a small pool of blood in her palm as well. She was stunned. Blood seemed to be seeping out of her hand and forehead for no reason. Then, An heard someone whispering behind her. She turned around and saw two of her classmates huddled together and pointing at her. Then another girl noticed and tapped the boy next to her on the shoulder. Within seconds, the whole class was gawking at her. An was mortified. She darted out of the room and down the hall to the bathroom. She made sure nobody else was inside. Then she turned on the faucet and scrubbed her hands and face until all the blood was gone. And then after that, she inspected her forehead and palms in the mirror, but there weren't any cuts on her body. An couldn't understand where this blood was coming from, but she still didn't want to tell the teacher or her mom. To her, that would just make the whole problem worse. And right now, all she wanted to do was forget this morning ever happened. One afternoon, a year later, An's mother, Tui, was walking An home from school. She tried to ask her daughter about how her day went, but An just stared at her feet as they shuffled down the busy sidewalk. An, who was 13 years old now, had spent the past year acting very quiet and withdrawn. She was always checking her reflection in shop windows and running her hands over her face like she was checking for acne or something. Plus, An wasn't in any school activities this year. An had always been shy, but she was becoming a loner. Tui wasn't sure what to do about it. Once they got home, An kicked off her shoes and went straight into the living room without saying a word. But Tui cried out in surprise when she saw that An was leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the ceramic floor. She ran to her daughter to see if she was hurt. An whirled around and looked down at the floor, but instead of checking her feet for an injury, she began wiping her forehead and inspecting her palms. Tui asked what was going on, but An didn't say anything. Instead, she just flopped down onto the couch and buried her face in her palms. Tui felt like her daughter must be hiding something, and so speaking very firmly, she told An to explain right now. An looked up, her face shiny with sweat. Then, red droplets began falling down An's forehead. Tui couldn't believe her eyes. It looked like An was sweating blood. But An didn't seem shocked by this at all. Instead, An just seemed sort of embarrassed. Then Tui remembered something. Over the past year, she'd occasionally found small traces of blood on An's clothes. She hadn't thought much of it. She figured An got little scrapes and cuts sometimes, like all kids do. But now, Tui asked her daughter if all those stains had been this bloody sweat. An nodded and said yes, then burst into tears. An said she was absolutely miserable. For the past year, in addition to sweating blood, she'd been spontaneously bleeding from her palms, the soles of her feet, her scalp, sometimes her arms and legs, and even her torso. And so her classmates thought she was really weird, and they made fun of An every time this happened. And also her friends didn't talk to her anymore because of the bleeding. The whole school basically shunned her for being this freak. An said she had tried her best to hide the bleeding, but Occasionally, she would bleed through her school uniform and everybody would see. Tui didn't know what to think. She couldn't believe that she hadn't realized this was going on. But at this point, all she thought was her daughter clearly needed help. She had to get on to the doctor as soon as possible. A few days later, a physician at the local hospital named Dr. Nai Nguyen stood in an exam room with An and Tui. As she inspected An's scalp, An explained how this spontaneous bleeding had basically made her a laughingstock at school and was ruining her life. Now, Dr. Nguyen could tell that An was clearly deeply distressed here, but far more pressing to the doctor were these symptoms. They were so confusing. Dr. Nguyen had never heard of anybody spontaneously bleeding from their extremities like this. It was totally alarming, and while Dr. Nguyen would never say this out loud, especially to An, it was a bit creepy too. The doctor was very cautious as she combed through An's hair, searching for cuts, scars, ulcers, anything that might explain the bleeding. But there was no markings of any kind on An's scalp or anywhere else on her body. And so after the exam, Dr. Nguyen peeled off her latex gloves and told Tui that she wanted to admit her daughter to the hospital to run some more tests. She would test An's blood to see if An had an underlying disease like anemia or a blood clotting problem, which might explain the sudden bleeding. She would also check for infectious disease. Whatever was wrong with An, Dr. Nguyen was confident that the lab work would show what was going on. But a few days later, Dr. Nguyen got the test results back. And An's blood work, her urine test, the chest x-ray Dr. Nguyen ordered, all of these tests came back normal. On paper, An was completely healthy. Even a malaria test came back negative. Dr. Nguyen couldn't find a single reason for An's bleeding. And unfortunately, even though An claimed to have bled at least a few times since being admitted to the hospital, Dr. Nguyen had never been present to witness the onset of the bleeding, which made Dr. Nguyen consider a different possibility. An said she often bled from her palms, feet, forehead, and torso. And while Dr. Nguyen was not Christian, she still knew these were the same locations on the body where, according to Christian doctrine, Jesus had bled from during his crucifixion. And according to some Christians, they believe these wounds can appear on others like a holy marking. These markings, which mirrored the wounds from the nails in Jesus' hands and feet, the crown of thorns on his forehead, and the spear wound in his side, are known as stigmata. And so Dr. Nguyen began to wonder if An wasn't actually sick, but faking these stigmata-like wounds for religious reasons, or just for attention. An did say that everybody in school knew who she was now because of this bleeding, so she was getting lots of attention. She said they treated her like a freak, but Dr. Nguyen knew that attention seekers didn't always search for positive validation. Negative attention could feel just as rewarding. If An was faking this, that would also explain why An hid the condition from her mom for more than a year, and why no one at the hospital had actually seen An while she was actively bleeding. The blood always seemed to appear when she was alone, so doctors hadn't been able to determine where it was actually coming from. Dr. Nguyen realized this situation was going to be very tricky. An would almost certainly insist that her symptoms were real, and it would be up to Dr. Nguyen to figure out if she was lying or in genuine need of medical intervention. The next morning, Dr. Nguyen walked into An's hospital room as An was finishing breakfast. Tui sat in a chair against the wall, flipping through a magazine. Dr. Nguyen closed the door for privacy and told Tui and An about the test results. She explained that without any evidence, it was going to be very difficult to diagnose An with a medical condition. As An and Tui absorbed the news and looked pretty upset about it, Dr. Nguyen turned to An and told her very gently that, school can be very stressful and bullying especially can make people really upset. And so it would be totally understandable if when An was feeling overwhelmed at school, that maybe she had begun to fake these symptoms, maybe to get out of a test or just to get out of a room or something. But the second Dr. Nguyen said this, An just stared at her with a look of pure disbelief on her face. She promised Dr. Nguyen that she had never faked the bleeding. She said she would just feel achy sometimes and then the blood would appear. She had no idea why this was happening, but it was ruining her life. She would never do this on purpose. Now, Dr. Nguyen was expecting this reaction, and so in an attempt to catch An off guard, she just said, An, are you causing these wounds yourself to look like the stigmata? An and her mother exchanged very confused glances. Tui shifted uncomfortably in her seat and explained that they were not Christian, they were Buddhist. There was nothing in their beliefs about bleeding hands or feet, and An said she'd never even heard of stigmata. The room fell into a brief silence, and then Dr. Nguyen had to admit that if An wasn't Christian, it was unlikely she was faking stigmata wounds. She could still be faking the symptoms for attention, but Dr. Nguyen still thought it was possible that An truly had a mysterious medical illness. And so if Dr. Nguyen was going to be able to help An, she would need more information. And so on her way back to her office, Dr. Nguyen stopped at the nurse's station, and she gave the staff strict orders to watch An closely and to let her know if the girl did anything unexpected or strange. A few hours later, Dr. Nguyen was getting ready to go home when she got a call. An Bui was bleeding. Dr. Nguyen hurried down the hallway to An's room, and when she stepped inside, she saw An sitting on the bed just staring back at her, and there was blood all across her pillow. An's mother was standing next to the bed looking very confused. Dr. Nguyen asked Tui if she had seen the bleeding begin, but Tui said no, she was asleep when it started. When Dr. Nguyen looked over at the nurse on duty, she shook her head no as well. She had not seen the bleeding start. She said that she had checked on An 15 minutes earlier and nothing was happening, and when she came back, An was bleeding. Dr. Nguyen snapped on a pair of latex gloves and then told An she was going to search for the source of the bleeding. Then she started moving her fingers through An's hair and pressing down on her scalp. And as she did, she could see blood smeared in An's hair, but she couldn't tell where it was coming from. She asked if An was in any pain, and An said yes, she had a headache, and she said she was feeling very tired. Finally, after not finding the source of the bleeding, Dr. Nguyen stepped back and told An that she wanted to take a few samples of the skin from An's scalp for testing. The procedure was called a punch biopsy. She would numb An's scalp and then cut out 3 little patches of skin and hair follicles, each about 3 millimeters long. After hearing this, An began to cry and said she did not want another test. Dr. Nguyen nodded and said she understood, but she told An this test could help them figure out what was actually wrong with her, and then hopefully she could get treated and go home. It took a minute for An to calm down, but eventually she did, and then she told the doctor she was ready to get started. The following morning, Dr. Nguyen received the biopsy results, and they showed something fascinating. An's scalp was covered in these microscopic pockets filled with blood. Dr. Nguyen didn't know why these spaces had formed or what was causing them to burst, but she intended to find out. Dr. Nguyen, during the biopsy, had also collected some of the bloody mixture that coated An's scalp, and results showed that it was actually a mixture of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and sweat. And it was the sweat that gave Dr. Nguyen an idea. She told An to go to the stress testing room in the cardiology department. And when Dr. Nguyen arrived, An was already standing glumly on the treadmill. An stared angrily at Dr. Nguyen, while a technician clipped the safety cord to her shirt, and a nurse double-knotted An's shoelaces. Dr. Nguyen couldn't blame An for being annoyed here, but she didn't have time to argue with an angry child. She had a case to solve. Because the bloody mixture contained sweat, Dr. Nguyen wondered if she could induce the bleeding with vigorous exercise. And so she was going to have An sprint on the treadmill to see if she could make her sweat turn red. Once everything was all set up, Dr. Nguyen nodded to the technician. The treadmill belt began moving, and the technician ramped up the speed until An was running. In no time, she was breathing hard and sweating. Except there wasn't any blood in the sweat. So Dr. Nguyen had the technician turn up the speed of the treadmill. As the belt moved faster, An struggled to keep up. Dr. Nguyen crossed her fingers, hoping that blood would appear on the girl's forehead. An's face grew pink and then beet red from the exertion. For a moment, Dr. Nguyen thought the blood was poking through An's skin, but then she realized An was just bright red from running so hard. Her sweat was still clear. Dr. Nguyen felt defeated as she told the tech to shut the treadmill down. Dr. Nguyen forced herself to smile. She told An she did great work, but she was secretly very frustrated. If a stress test didn't cause the bloody sweat, Dr. Nguyen didn't know what would, and so it made her turn back to her initial suspicion that An might somehow be causing the bleeding herself. Now, she couldn't understand how An might make her own scalp bleed, but it had been more than a week and still no one at the hospital had seen the actual onset of An's bleeding. Her own mom hadn't even seen it. And so if An was deceiving everybody, then Dr. Nguyen wanted to put an end to it, today. And so Dr. Nguyen pulled An's nurse aside and told her to sit by An's bedside overnight and to watch the child like a hawk. She told the nurse not to leave An alone, not even for a moment. A few hours later, An was startled awake in her hospital bed. Her forehead was pounding and she was drenched in sweat. It took a moment for An's eyes to focus, but when they did, she realized her nurse was standing right over her, looking absolutely stunned. An sat up and instinctively felt her face. And as she did, she immediately understood why this nurse was staring at her. An's face was covered in red, sweaty blood. She could feel it oozing out of her pores and trickling down her chin. But instead of helping her clean up, the nurse was just gawking at her. An closed her eyes and hoped the nurse would go away. She felt like a zoo animal on display for the whole hospital. When she opened her eyes again, the nurse was still looming over her, but instead of staring at her, the nurse smiled and told An she was going to call Dr. Nguyen. And she told An that she was now certain An could not be faking her symptoms. An was so relieved. A few days later, An would get her diagnosis. Once An had begun bleeding in her sleep in full view of that nurse, Dr. Nguyen was convinced the bleeding truly was spontaneous. But she still didn't understand why it was happening. After thoroughly searching medical literature for cases of spontaneous bleeding from the hands, feet, and head, Dr. Nguyen eventually discovered a rare condition that matched An's presentation. Its scientific name is hematidrosis. Now, not much is known about hematidrosis, but it's a condition that causes tiny blood vessels in the skin to break open. The blood inside these vessels might get squeezed out through the sweat glands or leak into hair follicles, causing the patient to essentially sweat blood. Doctors don't know exactly what triggers hematidrosis, but they think it could be related to stress, like the fight-or-flight response. This condition has been reported only in a limited number of documented cases, making it difficult to study extensively. However, there are some historical reports of similar cases. Some scholars believe that many documented cases of stigmata throughout history were actually just misdiagnosed cases of hematidrosis, which technically would have made Dr. Nguyen's initial diagnosis correct. An was suffering from stigmata, but not for religious reasons. In fact, Dr. Nguyen never discovered what actually caused An's bleeding episodes. But she did find a way to cure them. Dr. Nguyen prescribed An lorazepam, a mild benzodiazepine commonly used to treat depression. It helped reduce An's anxiety, and after 2 months on the medication, the bleeding stopped. Fifth, 2009, 41-year-old Kay Parsons woke up in her bedroom in the quiet suburb of Grovetown, Georgia. It was still dark outside, but Kay knew she had a busy morning ahead of her. So she got right out of bed and walked down the hallway to wake up her son. When she went into his room, her son, who was 12 years old, immediately began complaining that he didn't want to wake up yet, but Kay just flipped on his lights and said, "Come on, you gotta get ready for school." Once Kay saw her son actually climb out of bed and begin to get dressed, she rushed downstairs and poured him a bowl of cereal and left it on the table, and then called up to him and said, "Come on, come down, eat your breakfast." And then Kay rushed right back upstairs into her bedroom to get dressed. Now, normally, Kay had help with the morning routine from her husband, David. But David was in Los Angeles on business. David was a career military man who had become a successful civilian contractor after retirement, which meant David worked for the military, but he was not actually a member of the military. And generally speaking, civilian contractors with the military make a lot of money. David's work at a nearby army base is what had brought the family to Georgia 4 years earlier, and his job had allowed them to buy their beautiful 2-story, 4-bedroom home. But the trade-off with David's financial success was that he often had to travel for work, leaving Kay to manage on her own. Most of the time, Kay was perfectly happy to take on everything at home by herself because she knew David was doing his part for the family in other ways. Kay and David had been together since they were in high school, and people who knew them said they had the kind of partnership that made other couples jealous. They seemed to function as this perfect unit, and they always knew how to help the other. But the truth was, behind the scenes, Kay and David were not perfect, and lately they had been going through a really rough patch. They'd been getting in these horrible fights, and then after the fights would end, they would just ignore each other for long periods of time. And so as Kay rushed around her bedroom getting dressed for the day, she couldn't help but feel kind of resentful towards David for not being here that morning to help her. But Kay quickly told herself she was being foolish. Even though they were fighting, she knew the reason David was gone was for work. He was there to help the family, and so she couldn't really be resentful about it. Once Kay was finished getting dressed, she ran to her son's bedroom and grabbed his backpack and then went back downstairs to the kitchen. When she got there, her son said he was done eating, so Kay handed him his backpack, then she grabbed his empty cereal bowl and put it in the sink, and then she picked up her white leather handbag off the counter and took out her car keys. Then Kay stopped herself because she knew she was running around like a maniac, and she took a breath and then looked over at her son and smiled. Even when she and David were not getting along, they still made sure their son always felt like their house was filled with love and happiness. Kay's son smiled back at her, and then the two of them walked to the garage and got into Kay's car. Kay pulled out of the garage onto Hot Springs Drive, her quiet neighborhood street. And as she did, she looked over at the house next door, another beautiful brick home strikingly similar to her own. And in many ways, Kay and her family's lives in Grovetown were directly connected with that house next door. On the day that Kay, David, and their son had moved in, their next-door neighbors, Becky and Tony Sears, and their 5 kids, had dropped by with food to welcome them to their new home. From then on, the two households became inseparable. The adults played tennis together, one of the Sears boys was on the same baseball team as Kay's son, and the two families had vacationed together. Becky even got Kay a job at Healing Hands, the physical therapy clinic where she worked. And not long after Kay and Becky had begun working together, they joined Weight Watchers together. And Kay gave Becky a lot of credit for helping her meet her weight loss goals. Every day, Becky wanted to compare weights and discuss who had lost the most. It made Kay anxious, but she had to admit peer pressure worked. But in recent weeks, Kay had been so caught up in the problems she was having with her husband that she really hadn't even spoken to Becky. And as Kay drove past Becky's house that morning, she wished she could go back in time to when everything had seemed so perfect. After Kay dropped her son off at school, she went to a McDonald's drive-thru. Even though Kay was a part of Weight Watchers and was trying to lose weight, when she was really stressed out or rushed, she often treated herself to fast food. Kay quickly ate her McDonald's breakfast in the car as she drove back home. She was in a hurry because her handyman, Mitch Cozart, would be arriving at her house soon. Mitch was coming by to repair the back door. But as Kay drove, she was thinking about other projects she might ask him to take care of while he was already at the house. And Kay was still lost in her own thoughts about what she was going to ask him to do when she pulled back into her 2-car garage at around 7:15 a.m. Kay got out of her car and walked into the house carrying a half-finished cup of McDonald's coffee and an empty fast food bag. And within seconds of stepping foot inside of her house, Kay heard a loud crashing sound in the kitchen. It sounded like something breaking. Kay had no idea how anything could be falling in her kitchen, and so she quickly rushed around the corner to see what was going on. But what she saw in the kitchen was the last thing she expected. At 8:30 a.m., Kay's handyman, Mitch, walked onto Kay's front porch and rang the doorbell. He knew Kay was expecting him, so he was surprised when no one answered the door. After a few moments, Mitch pulled out his flip phone and called Kay, but Kay didn't pick up. Mitch peeked in the windows of the home, but he couldn't see anyone inside the house, so he walked around to the back. He was there to fix the elegant French doors that were in the back of the house, and so he figured he could at least take a look at the job while he was waiting for Kay. But when Mitch came around the corner of the house and actually saw these French doors, he froze, because one of the panes of glass in the French doors was completely shattered and the French door was open. He called out for Kay from the outside, but no one answered. Mitch had seen enough cop shows to know that he did not want to go inside this house himself and potentially leave fingerprints or footprints, and so instead, Mitch grabbed his phone again and he called 911 to report what appeared to be a break-in. But as Mitch was talking to the 911 operator, he noticed this young man with black hair sitting on the other side of the road on this rock, just staring at Mitch. And then as soon as Mitch got off the phone, the young man with black hair called out to him. Mitch walked across the street towards him, and as he did, he could see the young man looked pretty shaken up. When Mitch finally reached the young man, he told Mitch his name was Michael Bowers, and he lived next door to Kay, and he was actually Kay's friend Becky's oldest son, who was from a previous marriage. Mitch asked Michael if he was okay, but Michael said no. He said he'd overheard Mitch's phone calls to 911, so he knew that Kay's house had been broken into, and he told Mitch that his own house had been broken into as well. He said the house was ransacked with drawers emptied onto the floor and the whole place was a mess. Michael said he had just called his mother at work to let her know. At this point, Mitch was very worried, and he told Michael to stay right where he was and to not go back inside of his house because whoever had broken in might still be there. Then Mitch went back across the street to his truck, and he pulled out the gun he kept in the glove compartment just in case. Then he went back across the street and waited with Michael for the police to arrive. A few minutes later, Sergeant Jimmy Edmonds of the Columbia County Sheriff's Office arrived at Kay's house. His office had received 2 calls within minutes of each other to report break-ins in neighboring houses on Hot Springs Drive. Edmonds thought just 1 break-in would be very unusual for such a quiet, low-crime neighborhood, but 2 break-ins? Something strange was going on. Sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene soon after, and at that point, Edmonds walked around the house with them to the back door with the shattered glass. But before Edmonds even went inside the house, he saw an ominous sign. He could clearly see blood on the kitchen floor. Edmonds turned back around and looked at the deputies and made sure they saw the blood too, and they nodded, and then Edmonds led them into the house. And immediately Edmonds saw the blood trail went all the way out of the kitchen and down the front hall. And the blood was not just on the floor. There was also blood spattered all over the walls too. As Edmonds followed this grotesque blood trail all through the house, he passed by a spilled McDonald's coffee and a crumpled McDonald's bag and a white handbag on the floor. Then he saw a bloody handprint on the wall right beside the door to the garage, and he opened up the door. And there, lying beside her car in a big pool of blood, was Kay Parsons. Edmonds quickly rushed over and crouched down beside Kay and placed his fingers on the inside of her wrist, and amazingly, he found a pulse. Kay was alive, so Edmonds shouted for one of the deputies to call an ambulance. As Edmonds stayed crouched down with Kay, telling her over and over again that help was on the way, Edmonds just could not believe the amount of blood he was seeing, not just all over the house, but on Kay, on her face, her arms, her clothes. He had been investigating violent crime for years, but he'd never seen someone beaten as badly as Kay Parsons was. There was a bloody aluminum baseball bat lying beside Kay, and Edmonds was reasonably sure it had been used to bludgeon her. And then Edmonds also noticed there was a second weapon underneath the car, a bloody claw hammer. Seconds later, the ambulance finally arrived and Kay was rushed to the hospital. And as soon as she was gone, Edmonds led a room-by-room search of her house. And at first glance, it looked to Edmonds like Kay must have come home and interrupted a robbery in progress. The house was a complete mess upstairs and downstairs, as though someone had run through the entire house, searching every single drawer as quickly as possible. But the sheer brutality of the attack on Kay made Edmonds think this could be something else. I mean, what kind of burglar would suddenly begin bludgeoning someone to death with a hammer and bat just because they interrupted them? And so this just felt like a deeply personal crime to Edmonds, not just some random robbery. At some point during the room-by-room search, Edmonds stepped away and performed the grim duty of calling Kay's husband, David, to tell him what happened. Now, Edmonds didn't really go into any details over the phone. He just told David that he would need to fly home from Los Angeles immediately. David could tell obviously something terrible had happened, and by the time he hung up, David was reasonably sure that his wife had been badly injured. So he booked the first flight back to Georgia and rushed to the airport. Back at Kay's house, Edmonds knew he still had a second break-in to investigate, and he was afraid he would find another victim of a vicious attack. So Edmonds rounded up a few other deputies and walked next door to the Sears' home. The back door had been broken open just like over at Kay's house, and the contents of drawers in the Sears' home had been dumped all over the place just like in Kay's house. There were also smears of blood here and there, but not nearly as much as next door. The deputies combed the house from top to bottom, and luckily, they did not find another victim. Edmonds was searching the ransacked kitchen for potential evidence when Becky Sears, the mother, and her 19-year-old son, Chris, came into the backyard. Becky told Edmonds they had both been at work when her other son, Michael, had called to tell her about the break-in, so they'd rushed home as fast as they could. But Becky did not care at all about the fact that her house had been trashed and ransacked, because moments before Becky had walked into her house, a neighbor had told her that her good friend, Kay, had been taken away in an ambulance, and so all Becky wanted to know now from Edmonds was if Kay was okay. Edmonds was not really able to share any details about Kay, other than the fact that she had been alive when she was taken to the hospital. Within minutes, another neighbor appeared at the Sears' house and offered to give Becky and Chris a ride to the hospital to go check on Kay. And so Becky and Chris, they rushed out the door with that neighbor as fast as they had shown up, and Edmonds was suddenly left alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about all these terrible things that had just unfolded in this small, seemingly safe suburban neighborhood. Edmonds figured Kay's house must have come first, and the person who broke in killed Kay, and then they must have come over to Becky's house next, but still had Kay's blood on their hands. And so that was why there was blood in both houses, despite there only being a victim in Kay's house. But that didn't make Edmonds feel much better. He now knew he was dealing with a criminal who was cool enough and cruel enough to beat this helpless woman until they were totally covered in her blood, and then casually just go next door, again covered in their blood, to rob another house. Edmonds wondered what kind of person could do something like that. Becky and some of Kay's other friends stood vigil in Kay's hospital waiting room all day long. They were desperate to get any word on Kay's condition. Every so often, Becky would ask one of the nurses if she could go in to see her friend, but they always said no, because the medical team was still trying to stabilize Kay. Eventually, another friend did make it to Kay's actual bedside, and she didn't even recognize the heavily bandaged person lying there. Kay's face was grotesquely swollen, and she was attached to all kinds of tubes and wires that were keeping her alive. The nurse wouldn't answer when the friend asked if Kay was brain dead. Finally, late in the afternoon, Kay's husband, David, arrived at the hospital straight from the airport. Sergeant Edmonds and other officers escorted David past Kay's friends to Kay's room, and they let him go in there all by himself. Seconds later, from beyond the double doors, Kay's friends heard David begin to sob. Kay had just died. Some of Kay's friends began to weep when they heard David crying, but Sergeant Edmonds had a different reaction to David. He wondered if David's loud display of grief was just a bit too much. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Edmonds got the sense that David was just performing for an audience. While Edmonds was at the hospital, members of his investigative team had gone door to door all throughout Kay's neighborhood to try to get more information about what happened. But unfortunately, so far, they'd come up with nothing. Nobody in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything unusual between 7 and 8:30 a.m. that morning. So after Edmonds got back to the sheriff's department, he decided he would just bring in all of the people who had been at the crime scene one by one. And he started with Kay's handyman, Mitch. Once Mitch arrived at the station, Edmonds and Mitch would sit down across from each other in a small interview room. And Edmonds watched Mitch right away fight back tears as he recounted showing up at Kay's house and finding the smashed glass in the back door. Edmonds was initially skeptical of Mitch's story. After all, this guy had just happened to show up at the house right after Kay had been attacked. But Mitch would show Edmonds some emails that made it clear Kay really had been expecting him at her house at 8:30 a.m. that morning. And when Edmonds had searched Kay's house earlier, he hadn't seen any sign that Mitch ever went inside. So for the time, Edmonds decided Mitch was not a major suspect. But just when Edmonds was starting to think Mitch would have nothing useful to offer, Mitch began talking about the young man with black hair who was sitting on the other side of the street who had overheard his 911 call. The young man had told Mitch that his name was Michael and that he was Becky's oldest son. The mention of Michael made Edmonds' mind start racing. He had learned through his initial investigation that Becky's oldest son had a history of drug problems. The 22-year-old had once been a heroin addict. And Edmonds wanted to know why Michael was sitting across the street from Kay's house, which was now a murder scene, instead of in front of his own house, which had just been looted. Because remember, Michael didn't know what was going on in Kay's house until he overheard Mitch talk about Kay's house being robbed. And so Edmonds couldn't help but wonder if maybe Michael had tried to rob Kay's house to pay for his drug habit, but then Kay surprised him by coming home. She would have known Michael's face very well, and so maybe he decided to kill her so she wouldn't be able to identify him. Edmonds thanked Mitch for his help and ultimately let him go. Then he summoned Michael to the station. When Michael arrived, Edmonds led him into the small interrogation room, and the two sat down on opposite sides of a table. Michael was quiet and very polite, and as he sat there, he absently ran his hands through his dark black hair. Edmonds was very blunt, and he asked Michael if he was still using drugs. Michael admitted that he was. He said he was still fighting his heroin addiction, and in fact, that day, he had used methadone to try to curb his heroin cravings. Methadone is a medication that's often used to help people reduce or stop their use of heroin or other opiates. And so because Edmonds had wondered if Michael went to Kay's house to rob her to pay for drugs, Edmonds began to zero in on where Michael had been before the handyman Mitch had discovered the break-in at Kay's house. Michael stayed calm and polite. He claimed that his mother had dropped him off at 7 a.m. for a house painting job. But when Edmonds pressed Michael for details about this job, Michael's story fell apart. He couldn't say who he was working for or even where the job was. Now, Michael was starting to shift around in his seat uncomfortably. So Edmonds asked him again where he had been when Kay was attacked. Michael admitted he had been lying about the house painting job, but only because he didn't want his mother to know he was unemployed. He said he had really been watching TV at a friend's house. Edmonds was very annoyed that Michael had just lied to him, so he got up and walked out of the room. And Edmonds would keep Michael in that interrogation room for 3 more hours while he decided what to do with him. And in the end, Edmonds and his team, despite their suspicions, knew they really had no evidence linking Michael directly to this crime, so they couldn't just hold him indefinitely. But just before Edmonds was about to turn Michael loose, on a hunch, he asked Michael if he could look at the bottom of his sneakers. And when Michael showed him, Edmonds saw that wedged into one of the treads of one of his shoes was a gleaming shard of glass. When Edmonds asked Michael where the glass came from, Michael had no explanation. And so, as Michael walked out the door of the sheriff's office, he didn't know it, but he had just become Sergeant Edmonds' primary suspect. Not long after Michael left the sheriff's office, his 19-year-old brother, Chris, arrived for his interview. Chris was everything that Michael was not. He had a job, he had his own house, he had respectable friends, and he was so nervous when he sat down for his interview that Edmonds had to keep reassuring him that he was not actually in trouble yet. Chris said that he had gotten up that morning at about 7 a.m. He'd barely had enough time to brush his teeth before his mother, Becky, pulled up to his house. He had agreed to go work with Becky that day at the physical therapy clinic where she was the office manager. Chris was going to help out with several odd jobs around the building, but when his brother Michael had called about the break-in, Chris and his mom had left the clinic right away. Then, Edmonds got Chris talking about his brother Michael, and the conversation soon turned to Michael's drug habit. Chris confirmed that his brother was taking methadone again and struggling with his heroin addiction, and he was hanging with a very bad crowd. At this, Edmonds immediately grabbed a sheet of paper and a pen, and he asked Chris to tell him the names of the people Michael was spending his time with, who in theory might commit the kind of violent crime he was investigating. Chris looked at him and he said, "You might need a larger piece of paper." By midday on March 26th, so 24 hours after Kay had been discovered, Sergeant Edmonds was totally exhausted because basically he hadn't slept for the last 24 hours. But he knew he had a killer loose in his town, so he had no choice but to press on. And the more he found out, the more he suspected Kay's neighbor, Michael. First, Edmonds talked to the friend who Michael said he was with at the time of the murder. In a recorded conversation at the sheriff's office, Michael's friend emphatically said that he and Michael really had been watching TV together when Kay was attacked. But the friend offered to take a polygraph test right then and there, and he failed. Then, later in the afternoon, Edmonds called the owner of the physical therapy clinic where Kay's friend Becky worked, and the owner told Edmonds that Becky's son, Michael, had once stolen a company checkbook and written about $800 in bad checks before he was caught. The owner said he had agreed not to call the police after Becky had promised him that her son Michael would never step foot in the clinic again. But Edmonds still wondered whether the seemingly very laid-back and low-key Michael really had it in him to commit such a totally violent crime on this woman who seemed totally defenseless. But the evidence really was increasingly against Michael. The murder was looking more and more like a robbery gone wrong, either committed by Michael or one of his friends, and very likely just to get money for drugs. That evening, Michael and Chris's mother, Becky, was leaving work at the physical therapy clinic, and as she was walking down a dark walkway towards the parking lot, she thought she heard something in the bushes behind her. Becky turned around to see what the noise was, and she was totally startled to see a man wearing black clothes with a white baseball cap standing there in the bushes. Becky froze, and the man just started shouting at her that he wanted his money. Becky said she had no idea what he was talking about, but the man clearly was not playing around because he raised a gun and started waving it right in Becky's face. But Becky really didn't know anything about any money and so kept saying, I don't know. Finally, the man seemed to have enough and he lowered the gun from Becky's face to her left leg and he fired it right into her left shin. The bullet glanced off the bone and grazed Becky's right ankle. She felt a sharp pain rushing through both her legs and she collapsed to the ground. As Becky lay there stunned and bleeding, staring up, waiting to get shot again, the man actually lowered the gun and said next time he was going to shoot her right in the face. Then the man just turned and ran off into the darkness. Becky, who was totally in shock and had no idea what was going on, still managed to grab her phone in her pocket and she called 911. After an ambulance arrived and took Becky to the hospital, sheriff's deputies searched the nearby woods for the shooter. They didn't find him, but all of them assumed one thing. This attack was not random. This shooting had to be connected to the break-ins on Hot Springs Drive and to Kay's murder. Becky was resting comfortably in her hospital bed when Sergeant Edmonds arrived to speak with her. Becky seemed perfectly fine to talk about what happened, and she would give Sergeant Edmonds a very detailed account of her attack. But when Edmonds asked her if there was any way her son Michael could have had something to do with this shooting, she was very quick to reject it. Edmonds speculated to Becky that perhaps her son Michael owed the shooter drug money, so the shooter was taking it out on Michael's mother. But Becky would respond by saying no, her son used to owe people money, but he didn't anymore. He didn't have debts anywhere. Edmonds could see this line of questioning was likely going nowhere, because Becky, despite her situation, seemed to be very set on protecting her kids, which makes sense, even if her son was guilty, she's gonna protect him. So Edmonds decided to try a new tactic. He asked Becky if she had any relationship troubles. Was there anyone in her personal circle who might want to hurt her? Becky didn't answer. She turned away from Edmonds and just kind of stared off into the distance. Then, without looking at him, she told him that she had a terrible secret that she had to get off her chest. Then, Becky told Edmonds she had cheated on her husband. She said her husband was a truck driver, which meant he was away a lot, and during his absences, she had turned to another man for comfort. But she insisted the affair was over, and that she and her husband were working out their issues now. Edmonds had a lot more questions. But right at that moment, nurses began coming in and out of Becky's room to check on her. So for the time being, Edmonds just kind of let the topic slide without even finding out who this other man was who Becky had been romantically involved with. The next morning, March 27th, Edmonds was hoping that his third cup of coffee might finally wake him up. His investigation was only a few days in, but Edmonds had been going nonstop. Just then, Sergeant Edmonds' phone rang, and so he picked it up, and before he could even call out a greeting, the person who was calling him said they had information about Kay's murder that he needed to hear. Edmonds asked who the caller was, but they would only say they were close to Becky and her family. Then the caller said they knew who Becky was having an affair with. It was Kay's husband, David. The caller said the neighbors, Becky and David, had been having the affair for 6 months before the murder, writing love letters back and forth and hooking up all over town. Becky wanted both of them to leave their spouses so they could be together, But David was worried that he would lose custody of his son if he split from his wife. After the anonymous caller hung up, Edmonds desperately wanted to talk to Kay's husband, David, but he knew he would have to wait until after Kay's funeral, which was that afternoon. At Kay's funeral, David was surrounded by loving supporters who had no idea that he had been cheating on his murdered wife. But one of Kay's closest friends couldn't shake the feeling that David was acting strangely for a man at his wife's funeral. When she had given David a hug, he told her that he was sorry and that he never wanted this to happen. The friend didn't understand what that meant, but she didn't think it was the right time to ask. At the end of the service, David, Becky, and all of Kay's loved ones looked on with sorrowful expressions as 6 pallbearers carried Kay's casket out of the church. Then the pallbearers put the casket into a hearse for the trip to the cemetery. David walked with his son to a waiting car that would follow the hearse, but Sergeant Edmonds approached and stopped them. Edmonds took David by the arm and quietly told him that they needed to talk right away. He said he understood that the family was obviously grieving, but really this couldn't wait. Edmonds asked David to come to the station right after Kay was interred. That evening, David looked emotionally raw and weary when he sat down across from Edmonds in the small interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Edmonds then told David point blank that he was in serious trouble and that he would not be doing his son or his family any good if he lied right now to the police and ended up going to jail. David seemed to know what this was about, and he nodded in agreement. Then Edmonds asked him about the affair with Becky, and David definitely saw this coming because right away he just began confessing. David said his affair with Becky had started about 6 months earlier when she had flirted with him on the tennis court. They had been playing doubles against Becky's husband and Kay when Becky had made a bad shot. She had leaned in close and said to David that she was playing badly because he was distracting her. Not long after that, the two began meeting at his house, her mother's house, or in their cars like it was some kind of high school romance. David said that he and Becky had pledged their love for each other, but he was just not ready to upset his own marriage. He worried that if he got divorced, Kay would take their son far away from him and prevent him from seeing him. So David and Becky's affair remained secret. But then David said he had broken things off with Becky a month before Kay's murder. David had told Becky they couldn't be together, at least until his 12-year-old son had graduated from college. David said that Becky was devastated, but she had accepted his decision and decided instead to focus on her own relationship with her husband. And Becky really had begun working on that relationship with a bracing dose of honesty. She admitted to her husband that she had been having an affair with their neighbor, David, and her husband did not take it well. He was shocked and furious, and he immediately called Kay to ask if she knew that her husband, David, was having an affair with his wife, Becky. Kay was totally caught off guard and said she absolutely did not know that. After that, David had had no choice but to confess to Kay about the affair and then beg for Kay's forgiveness. And to his surprise, Kay had accepted his apology and said they would work through their crisis together. But Kay had said she would not have her family living next door to Becky any longer. She wanted to sell the house immediately. Kay had also quit her job where she and Becky worked together, and she vowed never to speak to her former friend again. David said he was done speaking to Becky too, and that he was ready to make a fresh start. When David finished talking, Edmonds just stared at him for a second, and then looked down at his notes. Edmonds had all of David's cell phone records, and he knew that David had continued talking to Becky after their supposed breakup, including a call that lasted nearly 2 hours on the night before Kay's murder. And when Edmonds brought this up to David, that clearly David had just lied to him about his real relationship with Becky, David's face turned beet red, but he pressed ahead again. He admitted he had spoken to Becky numerous times after the breakup, but it was just to see how she was holding up. But on the night before Kay's murder, when David was in Los Angeles on business, he admitted that that long conversation he had had with Becky had turned sexual. And on that call, they had both admitted that they still had strong feelings for each other. Edmonds said that could explain the call David made the night before the murder, but David had also called Becky right around the time Kay was bludgeoned to death, so Edmonds wanted to know what that call was about. David said he had only talked to Becky on the morning of the murder because at the time he'd been worried about his wife. Kay hadn't picked up when he had called her, so kind of out of desperation, he had just called Becky to see if maybe she had heard anything about Kay. Edmonds didn't say anything back to David, But inside, he wondered if the real reason David had called right at that time was to find out if his wife had been murdered yet. David seemed to know exactly what Sergeant Edmonds was thinking, so David quickly denied having anything to do with Kay's death. He said the last thing he would ever want to do was take his son's mother away from him. Before David could say anything else, Edmonds cut him off and said, desperate people do desperate things. At this, David just kind of hunched over and fell silent. It was now dark outside, and the interview had gone on for 3.5 hours. Edmonds stood up, stretched, excused himself, and walked out of the room. Then, once he was outside the room, he watched from the other side of the one-way glass as David started to cry. And as he cried, all they could hear David saying to himself was, "Everyone is going to blame me." Edmonds knew David had been in Los Angeles at the time of Kay's murder. But after this meeting with David, he thought David could have been involved in some way. After all, David's wife was murdered, and the woman he'd been having an affair with was in the hospital from a gunshot wound. Later that evening, Edmonds was at his desk when he received a very strange call from an inmate at the county jail. The inmate said he knew who killed Kay Parsons. Edmonds asked why he should trust a guy who was in jail at the time when Kay had died, so how could he possibly know the truth? And the inmate just said Edmonds really needed to trust him because before he ended up in jail, Kay's killer had asked him to help with this murder. Edmonds was reasonably convinced that this guy had real information, but the inmate made it clear to Edmonds that he wanted to give him the information in person. So Edmonds hung up and he immediately headed to the jail. And Edmonds was waiting inside of an interview room when guards escorted in a middle-aged man dressed in pink jail sweats and flip-flops. The inmate did not hold anything back when he spoke to Edmonds, and by the time Edmonds left the county jail, he had multiple new leads to follow up on. And within days, those leads would pay off, and the police would finally figure out who had killed Kay. Based on information provided by that inmate, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kay Parsons on the morning of March 25th, 2009. At around 7:15 a.m., the killer saw Kay's car driving down the street towards her house. So the killer quickly darted around to the back of Kay's house to those French doors. The killer had a claw hammer in their hand, and so after looking around to make sure nobody could see them, they raised that hammer and then smashed in one of the glass panes on the French doors. Then the killer reached in through the opening, unlocked the door, and stepped inside of Kay's kitchen. Now, at the same time this was happening, Kay actually was entering the home through the front door. And so the killer figured Kay must have heard the glass shattering. So the killer just kind of clutched their hammer tight and waited to see what Kay would do. A few seconds later, Kay walked into the kitchen to see what was going on, and she saw a person standing there carrying a hammer, and so naturally she began to scream. Before Kay could turn and run, though, the killer leapt at her and swung the hammer wildly. Kay immediately threw her arms up to protect her head and her face, but the killer just kept beating her arms with the hammer over and over again until she lowered them, at which point the killer began smashing Kay in the head and the torso, and blood began spraying everywhere. Kay stumbled backwards out of the kitchen, barely conscious, but somehow she managed to turn and actually run away from her killer. The killer was totally shocked that at this point Kay was still on her feet, and so for a second the killer just stood there watching as Kay kind of stumbled down the hallway. But when Kay actually reached the door that led into the garage, the killer kind of realized what they needed to do, and they chased after Kay. And so Kay, she gets that door open, and she manages to walk into the garage, but by this point she had lost so much blood, she was so badly beaten that she just fell to the ground right by her parked car. The killer rushed into the garage after her, and then stood over Kay and raised the hammer, but the hammer was so slick from all the blood on it that when they tried to bring it down, it slipped out of their hand and slid under Kay's car. In a panic, the killer looked around the garage for another weapon to finish Kay off, and their eyes fell on the aluminum bat propped up against the wall. The killer lunged for the bat and then came back over to Kay and they stood there bludgeoning her over and over and over again until she wasn't moving. The killer, the garage, and Kay were now all covered in blood, and the killer was reasonably sure that at this point Kay was dead. They had no idea she actually still had a pulse. The killer dropped the bat and ran back into the house. They trashed every room inside, throwing things on the ground and doing whatever they could to make it look like this was a robbery. Then, feeling satisfied, the killer crept out through the open French door, stepping on broken glass as they left. Once they were outside, the killer glanced back and forth to make sure nobody had seen them. Then they ran right next door into Becky's house and ransacked that place too. But then, after they were done, instead of leaving, the killer stripped off their bloody clothes and found a fresh set of clothes in that house to change into, and then they grabbed their phone and called their mother. It would turn out Becky's heroin addict son, Michael, who everybody assumed was involved in some way with this murder, had nothing to do with it. Becky's other son, Chris, the so-called good son, he had been the one who murdered Kay. Chris had always been Becky's favorite child, and he would do anything to make his mom happy. Becky had told Chris things about her life that she would never tell her other son, Michael. So Chris was aware of the fact that his mom was having an affair with their neighbor, David, and that she believed David was actually still in love with her. And so Chris also came to believe that his neighbor, Kay, was actually standing in the way of his mother's happiness. In fact, Becky had even said to Chris that she wanted Kay dead. And all of this information began to come to light when Sergeant Edmonds met with the inmate who had called him. It turned out the inmate was Becky's own brother, and he told Sergeant Edmonds that Becky had asked him if he knew anyone who could kill Kay and make it look like an accident. At first he had thought she was joking, but after Becky kept pressing him, he knew she was serious. So when he learned that Kay really had been killed, he was sure his sister had something to do with it. And so that's why he reached out to Sergeant Edmonds. Now, after hearing this from the inmate, Edmonds still believed that Michael had to be involved, that maybe Becky had asked him to carry out the murder. But when Edmonds questioned Michael again, it was clear the young man had no idea about his mother's affair. So Edmonds went back to the hospital to meet with Becky, who was still recovering from her gunshot wounds. Edmonds interrogated Becky, and she finally cracked. She admitted that she had told her other son Chris all about the affair and about how much she hated Kay, but Becky didn't stop there. She told Edmonds that she had asked Chris to confront Kay on her behalf on the morning of the murder, but she said she didn't think her son would do anything violent. But after Chris had just killed Kay and then came back to his own house and staged another break-in and changed out of his bloody clothes, he had called his mother and told her he had just murdered Kay. She had driven to the house, picked Chris up, and gone with him to dispose of his bloody clothes, and then when they came back to the house, because her other son Michael had called her saying, "Oh my goodness, our house has been broken into," when she and Chris came back, all the police were there, and she would tell the police right away that she and Chris had been working at the clinic all that morning. And then after that, Becky and Chris had staged the shooting outside of Becky's work. Chris was the shooter who had leapt out of the bushes. Becky hoped this shooting would remove suspicion from her and her family and allow Chris to get away with Kay's murder. Even after admitting all of that, Becky still insisted that she had nothing to do with Kay's death. She told Edmonds that she had just totally messed up when she had given her son, Chris, the impression that she really wanted him to go do something horrible to Kay. But police and prosecutors did not believe that Becky was as innocent as she let on, and so both she and her son Chris were arrested. In the end, Becky and Chris pleaded guilty to the murder of Kay Parsons in order to avoid the death penalty. Both are now serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. 32-year-old Henry McCabe was living just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, with his wife Corrine and their 2 daughters. Henry was a Liberian immigrant who worked as an auditor for the Minnesota Department of Revenue. On September 6th, Henry's wife and his 2 kids head out to California to visit with some family, leaving Henry alone. Henry decides, you know what, I don't get a chance to go out very much because I'm working all the time, I got family, and so tonight I'm going to cut loose. So he calls his 2 very close friends and they decide to go to a nightclub. They get to the nightclub and Henry very quickly starts drinking a lot of alcohol, and lots of people that were at the club would would say he seemed pretty intoxicated. The trio would stay at the nightclub till about 2 in the morning, and then when they left, Henry, who had driven there and met his two friends at the club, was about to drive himself home when one of his two friends said, "Wait a minute, you can't be driving. We'll give you a ride home." So Henry gets in the car with them and they start driving to Henry's house. But when they're about halfway there, Henry tells them to go to a very specific gas station. He said he wanted to get food and a drink, but the gas station he was trying to go to was 2 miles in the opposite direction away from his house. And his friends are telling him, we can bring you to a closer gas station. We can bring you somewhere that's more convenient. But Henry was really aggressive and very adamant that that was the gas station he wanted to go to. And in fact, "I don't even want you to wait for me. I want you to drop me off. I will get whatever I want and then I'll walk home." And his friends put up a bit of a fight, but ultimately they relented and they drove him to this gas station. They dropped him off. They watched him go inside and they turned around and they left. At 2:28 in the morning, Henry's wife, Corrine, looked at her phone and she saw she had a missed call and a voicemail from Henry. She opens it up and she listens to it and she's horrified at what she hears. On the voicemail, Henry sounds incredibly distressed. He's yelling that he's been shot and it sounds like he's in pain. And then in the background, you hear this really intense growling sound. It's pretty easy to distinguish. And then Henry starts screaming about whatever is growling at him. And then Henry yells out, "Stop it," before the phone cuts out. The full 2-minute voicemail has never been released by police. This is what was made publicly available. Right after Corrine listens to this voicemail, she tries calling Henry, and it goes straight to voicemail. So she tries calling Henry's brother. She can't get in touch with him, so she calls the police. So the police go out looking for Henry. They go to his house. He's not there. And then they track down the two friends he was with, who immediately tell them, "Hey, we dropped him off at this gas station. We know it's a little bit strange that he wanted to go here, but he was insistent, and so that's where we dropped him off." So the police look around the gas station. They talk to the attendant. They talk to some people that were there. And no one knows where Henry is. So at this point, the police pull Henry's phone records, and they can see he placed a call to his wife at about 2:23 in the morning, but they can't determine where he was when he placed this call. The assumption is he was at the gas station. Then, just a few minutes later, he places another call to his brother, and his brother would report to police that all Henry was doing on the call was just sobbing. And again, with that phone call, the police were not able to pinpoint where Henry was when he made the call. And following that call to his brother, he turned his phone off. Several hours later, his phone would turn back on and it would ping about 4 miles away from this gas station, and then his phone would turn off again. And the police are thinking, you know what, it's a grown man. He went out drinking with his friends. He's bound to sober up and turn up at some point. Let's just wait this one out. But Henry didn't turn up. And days turned into weeks, turned into months, and no one's heard from Henry. No one has any idea where he is. On November 2nd, so 2 months after Henry goes missing, his body is found in a lake up near the area where his cell phone had last pinged. This area is a very difficult area to access. There's no public access to this lake, and the lake sits in a very heavily forested area. Even though Henry had told his wife on the voicemail that he had been shot, and it sounds like he's being attacked on the voicemail, there were no injuries to his body. And so even though the case was bizarre to everybody involved, they ruled it an accidental drowning. Some say he took his own life because he had recently bounced a check for his rent and he had a bad performance review at work. Others say he was just intoxicated and stumbled into the lake and drowned. But neither of those explanations account for the very obvious growling and strange sounds that we heard on his voicemail. And so to this day, Henry McCabe's death remains a mystery. 911 dispatchers hear a lot of interesting stories coming from the other end of the phone. But one group of dispatchers out of Reno, Nevada may win the award for the creepiest 911 calls ever received. When the details of these calls they got were put online, the internet went crazy. Here is their story. There was this old couple that lived about 20 miles east of Reno, Nevada. In 2010, the husband dies, leaving the wife all alone in this house. Shortly after his passing, she began calling 911 2-3 times a week, requesting things like, "Can you please put some water on to boil? Hey, can you change the thermostat?" It was clear she was showing signs of dementia, and the dispatchers were respectful of her and gently told her that this is 911, you can only call if it's an emergency, and at some point the woman would understand her mistake and she would say sorry and she would hang up. No first responders were ever sent out for answer these calls because it didn't seem like an emergency. It just seemed like a confused elderly person. But no matter how many times they told her, she kept calling back. And eventually her calls took a turn. Instead of calling 911 to ask for help with mundane tasks around the house, she would call 911 believing she was talking directly to her deceased husband, John. The dispatcher would pick up and the woman would say, "John, where are you? John, John." By this time, the dispatchers had gotten so many calls from this woman, they would recognize her address coming through and they knew what to expect. They would answer the phone, they'd be respectful, and they would tell her, like they always did, "This is 911. You can't call here. You need to talk to your family." And again, they did not send a responding unit out to her because it just seemed like she was confused, not in any danger. But one day when she called, she sounded frantic and scared. "John, please come home. Help me. I need help. John, come home." This time, they would send first responders out to the woman's house. When the responding unit arrives at her house just minutes after she had placed the 911 call, they go to the door and they're knocking and they're yelling for her and she's not coming to the door and it's all quiet in the house. The door is unlocked, so they open it up and they announce themselves. They walk inside and immediately they can tell the heat is not on because it's very, very cold inside the house. They look around the first floor and they can't find her, and there's no sign of a struggle or any obvious problems that could have happened inside of the house. So they go upstairs and they start searching all the rooms and no one's there until they get to the last room, and it's the bedroom. They go inside and there's an older woman who's lying on the bed and she's clearly deceased and has been for several hours because rigor mortis had already set in. The police are able to confirm that the woman who's lying on the bed is the same woman who owns the house and lives there. And at this point, they call back to dispatch and they tell them, "Hey, the woman that you claim made this 911 call, well, it can't have been her because based on rigor mortis, she was dead at the time that 911 call was made." But the dispatchers are like, "No way. We know what she sounds like. We speak to her multiple times a week. We have a whole protocol built when we see her address come across because we speak to her so often. That 911 call that you got that led you to that house where she was, that call was made by her." What they ultimately decide is the reason for this discrepancy is she didn't have rigor mortis. She was just stiff because it was really cold inside of her house, and that she had died in those couple of minutes between leaving the 911 call and when officers arrived. But in the back of everybody's minds, they're a little freaked out. A few days go by and another call is placed to 911 coming from that woman's home address. The dispatcher sees that and has to do a double take, like that's not possible. But they're thinking, okay, this could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be anything. Picks up the phone and she's shocked when it's the same woman who is frantically yelling for John to come here, save me, help me, I need help. And the dispatcher, who's well aware of the history and well aware that this woman's supposed to be dead, stays calm, goes through the procedure, tries to get more information from this woman, but the call ends abruptly and there's no more information to be had. And so not knowing what else to do, she asks a responding unit to go check this house out. The responding unit goes over to the property. They knock on the door. No one's inside. The door is actually still open. They go in. The house is empty. There's no one there. There's no one that could have made that call. At this point, dispatch is like, okay, this has got to be a prank. But the next day, same thing happens. Here comes a call from the dead woman's house. They pick it up and it's this distraught woman yelling for help. "I need my husband." And the dispatcher is trying to get more information, but they can't. And then the line cuts out. Once again, they have to send responders to this location because this woman has called 911 and is saying that she needs help. And once again, the officers get to the house and it's vacant. Just like when she was alive, these calls would persist multiple times a week. They continued even after her house was broken into and burned to the ground. There's not even a house anymore. And there are still calls coming through from that address to 911. Finally, the police get in touch with the phone company and they explain the situation, and the phone company looks at their records and they say, actually, her phone line was disconnected almost immediately after she was deceased. But they tell police there's a chance that it might not have been disconnected properly at the site, and that could be a reason why it's still working. So they send a lineman to go check out the actual property to confirm her lines were disconnected properly and that no wires were getting crossed. And he said all of it checked out. Everything has been detached this whole time. The phone company thought perhaps there was a digital recording of her that got trapped in their system and was randomly bouncing to their call center. But the dispatchers would say, it doesn't sound like a recording that's playing the same every single time. It's always the same message. She's yelling for her husband to come save her. But the way she sounds phones is always different. It's a unique phone call every single time. So because there wasn't a definitive explanation for why this was happening, they had to treat each call like it was serious. And so multiple times a week for a year, they received these ghost calls and had to send out responding officers to check on her, even though the house was gone and there was nothing there and there was never anyone there. It was just a vacant lot. And then finally, a year after this woman has died, the calls just abruptly stopped. And the police did not launch an investigation into what it was, because the reality is police need to prioritize things that are threats to people or places. And this really wasn't either of those things. It was just really bizarre. And so the official explanation for how a dead woman could be calling 911 from a non-existent phone line in a non-existent house for a year is, we don't know. The following stories all take place in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. On New Year's Eve 1980, 20-year-old Karen Potak was out at a bar with her friends celebrating, and at some point in the night, she slipped out because she didn't want to stay any later, and she began walking home. Now, she didn't have a jacket on, and it was very cold outside, and she's kind of stumbling through the streets, and a man sees her and pulls over and offers to give her a ride home. She's kind of intoxicated, and so she agrees to get in his car, and they drive off. A couple hours later, around 3 a.m., the police received this phone call.
Yes, please, this is an emergency. Please send a squad car to Pierce Butler Road, Malmberg Manufacturing Company Machine Shop. Please send an ambulance too. There's a girl hurt there.
Can you tell me what happened to her?
Just hurry. She's laying on the ground in the back by the railroad tracks by the engine room. Hurry.
What's the address?
I don't know.
Who are you?
Using this information from the caller, the police arrive in the back of that building and they find Karen Potak. She had been repeatedly bludgeoned over the head with a tire iron and then left for dead. Miraculously, she would survive, but because of her head injury, she forgot almost everything about that night, including the description of the guy who picked her up and who probably attacked her and who probably was the one who called police. So the police tried to interview some people in the area around where she was found, but it was a really deserted area and no one knew anything, and there was no physical evidence left at the scene, so the case went cold. Then, 5 months later, the police received another phone call.
Oh, you find me? I just stabbed somebody with a knife pick. I can't stop myself. I keep killing somebody. Hello? Are you there?
At this point, the police were not connecting this call with the call that immediately preceded finding Karen Potak, meaning they did not think that was the same person. And since in this call there were no instructions on where to find this person, they didn't really have anything to go on, so they took note of it, but ultimately kind of disregarded it. But just a few hours later, a group of teenagers were walking through the forest when they found a dead body. The body belonged to 18-year-old Kimberly Compton, who had literally just moved to Minnesota. She graduated high school and decided she wanted to start fresh in Minnesota. She hopped on a bus. She goes to Minnesota. She gets off the bus. She goes into the first restaurant she sees, which is a diner. She sits down by herself. She's eating some food, and a man approaches her and says, "Hey, can I sit down with you?" And so she lets him sit down, and he asks, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And she says, "Oh, I just moved here." And this guy offers to drive her around town and show her the sights. And she's like, "Great." 15 minutes later, he would kill her with an ice pick. At this point, police are beginning to suspect that this person who keeps calling them immediately before they're finding women that have been attacked might be the same person. And 2 days after Compton was killed, they get another call that confirms this.
Don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry what I did to Compton. I couldn't help it. Don't know why I had to stab her. I'm so upset about it. I keep getting drunk every night. I can't believe I did it. It's like a big dream. I can't think of being locked up. If I get locked up, I'll kill myself. I'd rather kill myself than get locked up. I'll try not to kill anybody else.
From this point forward, they referred to this caller as the weepy-voiced killer. And even though they had his voice recorded, they didn't have any physical evidence because he didn't leave any at the scene with Compton either, so they didn't have much to go on. The police would go to the diner and they would talk to the staff that was there, and they would give a general description of the weepy-voiced killer, but it wasn't enough to pinpoint a suspect. So once again, this case went cold too. 6 months later, the police received yet another call.
Please don't don't talk, just listen. I'm sorry I killed that girl. I stabbed her 40 times. Kimberly Compton was the first one over in St. Paul. I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm sick. I think I'm gonna kill myself, I think.
Where are you?
I'm just going to. If somebody dies with a red shirt on, it's me. I've killed more people. I'll never make it to heaven.
Calm down.
A day later, they find the body of 40-year-old Barbara Simons floating in the Mississippi River, tucked up against some brush. The night before, Barbara had been out at a bar and she had offered a cigarette to a man she hadn't met before. They began flirting and kind of hit it off, and at one point they were going to leave together, and before they left, Barbara turns to one of the waitresses and kind of jokingly says, "Boy, I hope he's nice because I'm leaving with him." And the waitress, for whatever reason, had a really bad feeling about it and made a point of getting a really good look at the man she was leaving with. And that man, of course, would turn out to be the Weepy Boys killer, and as soon as he and Barbara left the bar, he would stab her to death and throw her in the Mississippi River. After the police began investigating this, they came to the bar and they interviewed that waitress, and she said, "I got a really good look at this guy." And so the police show her 100 different mugshots of previously convicted felons in the area, and she immediately identifies 38-year-old Paul Stefani and says, "That's the guy." Paul had been convicted for aggravated assault, and he also had a history of mental illness. Paul is immediately put under surveillance, but within 24 hours, he manages to ditch his tail and goes straight into downtown Minneapolis, where he picks up 19-year-old street worker Denise Williams. Paul took her down a dark alleyway, and she kind of sensed something was wrong. And so she grabbed a glass bottle that was sitting on the floor of the car. And when he went to attack her, she managed to hit him in the head and cut his face really, really badly. And she managed to protect herself enough that she could get out of the car and run away and save her own life. And a neighbor saw her running out of the car and kind of saw the whole exchange, didn't like how it looked, so they called 911. When police showed up, Paul was long gone. That same night, police get another call from the Weepy Boys killer. This one's a little bit different. He's actually asking for help for himself.
I need an ambulance.
Where?
1505 Westminster.
1505
Yes.
Westminster. What's the problem?
I'm all cut up. I got beat up.
What's your apartment number?
208. I'm bleeding.
208. Where are you bleeding from?
From my arm, my face, my head.
Now, by the time this call is being made, the audio recordings of his previous phone calls had been made public. They were aired on radio shows, on TV. People had heard his voice, and it's fairly distinctive. And the dispatcher recognized his voice and told police, "There's a chance the Weepy Boys killer just called us." So an ambulance comes and picks up Paul Stefani and brings him to the hospital, and when he's sitting in his hospital bed, police walk in and they apprehend him. He pled not guilty, and prosecutors did not actually have that much evidence connecting him to each of these attacks. They had these audio recordings, but that was about it. And so ultimately, he got 58 years in prison, not a life sentence. But considering his age, it wound up functioning like a life sentence. 12 years into that sentence, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and was told he only had a year to live. And so it was at this point that he confessed to all of the attacks, including one they didn't know about. He murdered 33-year-old Kathleen Greening in her own home. He just didn't make a phone call to police afterwards. Paul would die shortly after his confessions. So that's going to do it, guys. Let me know in the comments what you thought of these 3 stories, and I will pin the best comment at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to your birthday party, but then give them the wrong address. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just John Ballen 416. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we do sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and also some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Land. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Palaconda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Samantha Collins. Production support by Avery Siegel. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and also Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Laura Donna